Speaker spoke for 5 minutes and 35 seconds. The House then calls on the Leader of Opposition to begin the side opposition case.
Ladies and gentlemen, right now the salinity level in the rivers of Bangladesh, in the south portion, in the southern region, is increasing so much that fishes are dying in the forests. Practices and structures to moderate potential damage. So mind you, the word is moderate potential damage. It's not about combating climate change that the way it should be. The way people are supposed to be made aware of the fact that you should no longer be cutting down trees, you should no longer be emitting greenhouse gases, but rather it's going to be about doing huge fundraisers from developed nations according to the polluters pay principle, and trying to funnel it into adaptive measures such as creating flood defenses, setting up early warning systems for cyclones, or switching to crops that are far better under drought conditions. So, what do we understand from this definition of adaptation and the examples here with? It means that adaptation is basically just living with climate change. It means that we're no longer going to actually live in a country that has roads and cars, but rather it's going to be a country where houses are raised to an upper level. It's no longer, and you know, as beautiful as Venice is, I'm pretty sure it's going to take us a lot more time for us to reach that state in a flooded plain. Bangladesh, by the year of 2050, is going to be very much submerged underwater. In order to stop that, we need to continue the combat and the battle against climate change. For that, and we need to actually not go by adaptation. For that, we propose three principal arguments. Firstly, adaptation would mean less effort towards combating and more towards adapting, as explained by the definition, and how it is going to actually look. Well, right now, the funds that are being collected by BCCRF or BCCEF, all these government agencies, they are collecting funds from World Bank, they're collecting funds from different international organizations and bilateral sources, and funneling through NGOs, so that NGOs are going to start an awareness about adaptive projects. So that is a very long, elongated process, and that has several challenges in the context of South Asian countries, which is very important. How? Because in South Asian countries, the local governments are very much influential as far as, and when I say local government, I mean the village mullah or that village religious leader who are very much influential and who always want to wet their beak, so to speak. They would also want a cut of that money that's going to come from international people. And when they would want that, at that point of time, these people the actual fund that was given for adaptive measures, it is going to eventually, by the time it reaches the field, for actual implementation of projects that will be showcased in these adaptive measures, we'll see that not much of it is left. There is not going to be enough money to build flood defenses, or maybe if it was made at that point of time, it is going to be very shoddy and not really defend anyone. What is our third argument in this house? We believe that the moment of time you set in a measure of adaptation to actually start a process of living with climate change, since so much of it is dependent on the polluters pay principle, since so much of the money is going to come from international bodies and countries such as USA or China, all the developed nations, these nations are no longer going to feel accountable about the severe harm they have caused to the environment, the permanent disfigurement of the environment they have caused. And they're going to continue on their process of emitting more greenhouse gases, and they're going to continue to pollute the oceans of the earth. So what else are they going to do? And what is the logic behind this? Why would they do it? The reason is now they will have every time when they would be confronted about the disfigurement of the climate that they have done, they're going to say that, hey, we're paying all of you all this money so that you can live with climate change. Why are you complaining still? So there is that mentality that is going to set in. If it doesn't set in the sophisticated speeches of these different nations, it would at least be the mindset of the large corporations that are continuing to continuing to harm the climate. So what else are they going to do? They're obviously going to, as far as giving money is concerned, they're just not going to give money for free. They're going to obviously want to actually set in some conditions that they actually benefit from by the time when the money reaches the people, these people would actually follow the conditions from which they would benefit from. So when these kind of conditions are applied in these kind of loans, and there is this free pass that we're giving to these polluters of the environment, that yes, you can continue on your polluting way, we're just going to learn to adapt to how you change the world right now. We say that it is going to be an irreparable harm to mankind as a whole, because no matter how long, how many days no matter how much money you get, eventually at the end of the day, you cannot build enough raised homes for 170 million people in Bangladesh. You cannot build enough cyclone shelters because even if you do build it, there's just no way of predicting it. So there's just no way you would be able to actually help people. As opposed to that, we from opening opposition propose that we should actually continue the battle against climate change the way it has been fought. And the things that we have said so far, we believe are enough to take this case home. Thank you.
The House thanks both members of opening government for their speeches and calls on the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are all aware that people in South Asian continent are actually a little under the poverty belt. Yes, but that is no reason for which we're going to actually use adaptation to combat climate change. So that argument is not here nor there. The fact of the matter is that I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for telling us about transparency, integrity, accountability. These are three important aspects of adaptation finance, right? So all that money that is being collected from international bodies, they need to be actually funneled in a very efficient manner under the principles of transparency, integrity, and accountability. But here lies the problem. In Bangladesh society, corruption is not really a big fancy argument, but it is very relevant in this case. The thing is, transparency is a very important factor in which many government institutions are lacking. There are various examples of how when BCCRF has actually decided on 53 project proposals has received 50 project proposals of over 5,000 and shortlisted 53 project proposals for implementation, and they received these PPs from NGOs. They actually did not release on based on what criteria they chose those proposals. They didn't. There was no information of that in World Bank website or in any other source or any media. So there is already a flaw as far as transparency is concerned, because transparency is something that many of these organizations in this government do not do well. Secondly, the idea of integrity. Now, the idea of integrity is a very sophisticated idea, but unfortunately, it is very lacking in certain village leaders. And because of that integrity lacking, what they do is when they eventually receive the funds, they actually spend more of it on securing their own personal luxurious life rather than actually keeping majority of it or actually the whole of it for building projects that is going to be adopted. So the idea of integrity is also very much not very prominent. Yes, before I move on.
You say developed countries are the largest emitter of GHGs in the world, and we Southeast countries are the countries who are suffering at most. So still believing on that part, you just want to focus more on the mitigating of GHG emission by the largest countries, when our survival is at stake because of the impact of climate change. Do you believe on that?
I believe that we need to combat climate change. But if we were to follow adaptation as the only response in South Asian continent, the problem that will result from this is that we are going to actually focus too much on living with climate change as opposed to combating it. And since the large developed countries are the most emitters of greenhouse gases and whatnot, by following the polluters pay principle, we are actually forcing them to, not forcing them, but we're asking them to pay all this money to us, don't for the QS, pay all this money to us so that we can learn to live with climate change. But because of, if we do so, as I've stated in my previous speech, there is already a risk of them setting us extra conditions for giving us such large amount of loans. And aside from that, we also give them a free pass to think that you can continue on your merry way of polluting the environment, and like they wouldn't be able to. We wouldn't have that much power in our voice while we confront them. However, let's move back to the topic, the idea of integrity and accountability. So, like, yes, established by various examples of villagers who have village leaders who lack integrity, they do not actually, let's say, even help the volunteers of a particular NGO that has come to visit that land to maybe build a cyclone shelter. They're not hospitable enough because they know that this change, they're not hospitable in only circumstances when they see that the NGO hasn't directly given them enough money or brought them gifts and grants. So these are the different conflict that arises between local governments and with NGOs. And as far as accountability is concerned, so a NGO or let's say a student organization does a project by taking money from this huge fund. Eventually, even if the success of that project hasn't been reached as per their target, they're still overstating the facts. As far as reporting is concerned, they're still going to show all the most beautiful pictures that has been taken of the projects and overstate the number of people who have participated in the project, or maybe overstate the number of people that are going to be helped, which is going to be much worse. So these are the different kind of nitty-gritties in which accountability, integrity, transparency, this is different kind of incidents in which, or situations in which transparency, integrity, and accountability are lacking in this certain localized government. And when they are lacking, we say that this funding, which was being funneled, eventually does not help to reach the goal for which it was given initially, which was our second argument from opening opposition. Our third argument we have explained is about how we can we are giving the people of developed countries more power over us by taking money from them and letting them and not being able to confront them when they emit more greenhouse gases. And our first argument was about how we're going to forget the fact that we are going to forget to combat climate change. How can combating of climate change, how does it look? It looks simply as planting more trees. It is as simple as ensuring that severe state statutes and laws are put under court, and like prosecution is done of the corporations that has been doing all these greenhouse emissions. Those are the processes through which we can actually help to prevent this huge disfigurement of our environment. But that is no longer going to be in focus because now the developed country, which has been polluting for so many years and has made this planet unlivable, has decided to pay us a lot of money and told us that now you learn to live with climate change. And we from Opening Opposition don't stand for it. Thank you.
The House recognizes all four speeches from the upper house and calls on the member of government to start the lower house case.
Standing here and talking about the gap of known knowns and unknown unknowns, which is the impact of climate change and yet to be resolved. It is a challenge like how we are going to adapt about the climate change, and it is also urgency like how we are going to adapt to the climate change. Talking particularly about South Asian country, the country which poses 1.5 billion of its population and 750 million of people living inside South Asia are impacted or being vulnerable to at least one extreme event of climate change. So we cannot keep this science, we cannot keep these figures behind our lines. So again, if we are talking about the fund which is not in fact charitable, but fund is in fact causal. The cause behind the lots of politics behind the fund is actually a causal. Why do international society or why do the global society sit together and decide and come with a stumbling block of climate history such as Paris Agreement and realize the need for adaptation in the name of lots of small windows to which climate fund flows? For an instant, least developed country fund. For an instant, adaptation fund. Let me give you an example of adaptation fund that is being a pipeline of Nepal, and it is delivering the very peculiar need of food security, a very beautiful indicators which says that yes, the people in our country are hungry and adaptation need. In fact, the very basic need to fill the stomach is needed. So going to the house of those people and talking or keeping the word mitigation really makes no sense over there. And if we are to talk about and if we are to focus on the mitigation, of course we are not going to mitigate because we are not emitting that proportion of greenhouse gases and it's only 50% is please.
I don't believe, like you said, that it is right for 750 million people in South Asia to grow up and produce in life, believing that they have no obligation. Do you believe that it is right that 750 million people, like you said, to grow up and progress in life without believing that they have any obligation in life?
Yes, I do believe it because when we judge the things, when you judge the life, when you judge the modality, you just don't judge the adaptation phase. You judge overall integrated system of that nation and looking at the integrated system, looking at the, for instance, looking at the GDP of those countries, looking at the development scale of those countries, even looking at the corruption of those countries. So yes, I believe. But yeah, strategy. We need to be a very strategy. So I was talking about the proper proportion of the greenhouse gases that a South Asian country contributes is only 15%, and if we take out India from this proportion, it is really less. If I talk about Nepal, it is only 0.027%. And having producing a very feeble amount of greenhouse gases and asking the question about do we need to mitigate, it doesn't make sense actually. And the word comeback is not the word, because I have been realizing that the divergent view and divergent view from the opponent team to figure out the phenomenon, because combating is not mitigation, and mitigation is just opposite to adaptation. So combating comes in a breeze. It's not just simply if we are not adapting, we need to mitigate. They make the same sense over here. So let me again put the example of the vulnerability that we pose. 5 out of 10 most vulnerable countries are South Asian countries. And yes, if I give you an example of the glacier recession of the Himalaya that lies in the Nepal, that lies on the top of the world, and that is in fact right for us is being melted, and the life that is dwelling downstream to that Himalaya is already in the risk.
Ma'am, you said that there is 1.5 billion people in South Asia. What do you think the international implications of South Asia as a region detaching itself from the international consensus about mitigating climate change? What international implications will it have, and what global implications will it have?
Actually, talking about these things, when we talk, okay, we coming to the ground of the adaptation finance. When we talk about the reason and global things, the financial mechanism is already very sophisticated and made so as all the people globally have realized that yes, adaptation is required, so you are going to adapt. If adaptation would not be a matter for us to follow, then we would have opposed it at the time of the COP itself or in other negotiation itself. Anyways, so I was also talking about the various stumbling blocks of decisions that have so far been taken in climate negotiation, and that is a Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement very beautifully in its 7.1 article states about the need of the adaptation capacity build up in this reason. And we can again deny upon the decision of the Paris Agreement, which we still consider as a historic demonstration of English countries' combined effort to change the climate and all these things. Talking about the polluter spray principle, do we again equally come with the environmental cost and economic tools of this South Asian country and then compare it with other developed countries? Definitely we don't do that. That is why again I say that the economic tool and the environmental cost, when we compare, and the adaptation cost, when we compare, we are of course lagging behind, and that's why I want to put light into what my Prime Minister recently said, that yes, we do need adaptation, and adaptation is only the way which we can address the climate change impact in the South Asian country. Thank you.
The House thanks the member of the government for that speech and calls on the member of opposition to start side closing opposition.
Honorable Chairperson Madam, and honorable judges and members of the House. We see climate change. Obviously, there is consensus in this House about what it is and what are the problems we have faced when it comes to climate change. And there are different ways and methods which we can address climate change. And simply, we can divide them into two. One is adaptation, and one is mitigation. Adaptation includes processes like building shelters for people, providing emergency relief for demolition systems, etc. And of course, mitigation is reducing greenhouse gases, reducing carbon emissions, and moving on to renewable energy. Ladies and gentlemen, we are alarmed by the proposal made in this House by the government that South Asia, being one of the largest populated regions in the world and one of the strongest, the fastest growing economies in the world, we are going to detach ourselves completely from the process of mitigation and focus entirely, as the topic says, only on adaptation, ladies and gentlemen. We agree that adaptation is important for countries in South Asia. For Maldives, for Nepal, for Bangladesh, where we face many issues of climate change, we need to focus on adaptation. However, ladies and gentlemen, there is a huge implication, there is a massive implication, both nationally and internationally, when it comes to detaching ourselves from the process of mitigation, ladies and gentlemen. And I would like to bring out that implications, the negative effect of completely detaching ourselves from mitigation by bringing three major extensions for today's debate. First, ladies and gentlemen, our first extension is that the world cannot afford to bear another industrial boom from the East. And second, ladies and gentlemen, that we do not want South Asia to be trapped economically and in debt in the future. And second, thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, that we need integration for solving this problem as a global community. First and foremost, ladies and gentlemen, my first extension, that the world cannot afford to bear another industrial boom from the East. Ladies and gentlemen, why did government bring out this motion today, and how is that trying to justify? Their primary justification is that South Asia as a region contributes only 10% of the global carbon emissions, and therefore we do not need to focus on mitigation because it's not our fault, it's not our obligation, the rest of the world is to blame for it, we are going to focus only on adaptation. But there is an issue with that, ladies and gentlemen. If South Asia as a region detaches itself from this obligation, we see the country, the East, the South Asian region is a nation, is comprised of nations which are becoming highly industrialized. We see there's a huge population growth in this region. We see there's a massive level of urbanization in this region, massive increase in pollution, massive increase in carbon emissions in India, in Bangladesh, in countries of that sort, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, in the meantime, we also see that developed countries are focusing more on renewable energy. We see Germany focusing mainly on solar power. We see Netherlands focusing on wind energy, ladies and gentlemen. And we see developed countries trying their level best to focus their finances, to focus their governance on mitigation, to focus on preventing climate change for the future, ladies and gentlemen. In this imbalance of things, ladies and gentlemen, we would see that this 10%, in another 5 years, in another 10 years, will become 20%, will become 30%, and so on and so forth, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, if we do not focus on mitigation, we will not be able to maintain that 10% of living zero gap, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, the second prong under that argument, ladies and gentlemen, is that we believe in sustainable development. We cannot simply afford to deforest our countries and to focus completely on adaptation, ladies and gentlemen. We cannot afford to completely deplete our oceans of all the fish, of all the sea creatures, and then mainly focus on giving shelters for people suffering from floods and droughts, ladies and gentlemen. And this we see as a complete negation of the sustainable development goals, as a complete negation from the core principles in which South Asia stands. And before I move on, my second point, yes, sir. Yes.
If you have gone through the sustainable development goals, article goal number 13 says about the action to combat climate change. Under that, there are criteria related to mitigation as well as adaptation. So if sustainable development goals also focus more on adaptation, and also looking at the article 4.9 of the UNFP Policy Convention, there is a special provision for the least case of countries. And South Asian regions have the list of countries along with the emerging economies. Their priority is to adaptation. So we believe in that convention article and also address which are article.
So I would deal into a question in my third argument, which talks about international integration and why South Asia needs to lead the fight for mitigation and why South Asia needs to lead the world when it comes to mitigation. Now moving on to my second argument, ladies and gentlemen, is about why South Asia will be trapped both in debt and both economically in the future as a result of removing ourselves from the process of mitigation. Ladies and gentlemen, if you take the effects of climate change in the world today, we see India, certain parts of India suffering from drought. We see Bangladesh going under floods every year. We see the fisheries community in Sri Lanka and Maldives finding it difficult to engage in their daily livelihood because of the depletion of the number of fish in the sea due to rising temperatures in the ocean, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore we see these countries, these South Asian countries, are heavily dependent on developed countries. And as we are already aware, countries like Japan, US, UK, Germany, Norway, France these are the main donors which combat climate adaptation. They fund these climate adaptation projects and they hold these main countries in debt, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, these South Asian countries move into a circle of debt where we cannot escape from it, ladies and gentlemen. And these countries will be utilized for political purposes by these developed countries in the future. And thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, that we need integration for global community action. We see as a community we have come into a certain consensus. The Paris Agreement, the Rio Convention, these conventions and agreements are global conventions, ladies and gentlemen. Just imagine if 8 countries, which represent 1.5 billion people of the world, completely say, we don't need adaptation, or we don't need mitigation, ladies and gentlemen. Adaptation is fine, they are going ahead, ladies and gentlemen. If we stop implementing mitigation in our own countries, we cannot hold other countries accountable. We cannot advocate internationally for mitigation, ladies and gentlemen. Countries like Germany will also say, okay, fine, South Asia has given up solar energy, why can't we also give up solar energy? So on and so forth, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, based on these 3 major extensions, we urge this House not to vote in favor of the proposal from the government side. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
A small word of advice before moving forward. If speakers are raising POIs, please limit it to 15 seconds or less in the future. But with that, we thank the member of opposition for his speech and call on the government whip to close up side government.
Honorable Prime Minister, opposition leaders, and the House, member of the House. To sum up with the motion, adaptation should be the only response to this climate change impact within South Asian countries. Our Prime Minister has rightly mentioned that South Asian countries have been emits very much less as compared to the global emission of the greenhouse gas emissions, which is the source of increasing temperature and thus leads to the differential impacts in the South Asian regions, which are already aggravated by the environmental degradations and also the least economic situations in the country. We are less responsible of the GHG emissions. However, we have been doing a lot in our own way in terms of mitigation. When our opposition leader talks about mitigation is the sole responsibility that we need to focus on, I couldn't agree more, and the government side couldn't agree on that part. This part is we have been doing our best in terms of intended nationally determined contributions. If you go through the intended nationally determined contributions, which after have been submitted to the Unit Secretariat becomes the nationally determined contributions, there is a mention of the contribution from the least developed countries from each of the countries from the South Asian regions have been mentioning about the mitigation strategies in that document. Not only that, they are focusing more on adaptation. And adaptation is subject to availability of funding from the developed world, as it has been widely enshrined in the Article 4.8 and 4.9 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been ratified by 194 countries in 1994. So, adhering to that convention and adhering to the principle of that convention, which has clearly stated that common but differentiated responsibilities with respect to capabilities of the nations to focus more on their different measures of addressing the climate change impacts. So it's a historic responsibility of the developed world to combat the climate change impact through the mitigation actions at their community level in their nations. So for the country who are already at the vulnerable state, at the front line of the climate change impacts, why we only should focus more on mitigations? We are also focusing our development to be the low carbon climate development in our countries. We have been planning, we have been devising new policies, changing the institutional structures, and building our capacity through our own fund, like the British we have, the Bangladesh Climate Change Trust Fund is the only national fund that we have, and even in the case of Nepal, we have the National Climate Change Fund, which is focusing more on the capacity building within the country, using the fund from the national GDP and national revenue as well. Not only depending upon the international funding sources, but when it comes to climate change impacts, when we are not developing ourselves, when we haven't reaped the benefits of the development, when we haven't tasted the real benefits, taste of the development, and we are again suffering from the climate change impacts, which we haven't been in the line, which we haven't been supporting through the emissions in that scenario, why we only focus more on the mitigation? Are we the only people, are we the only nation in the world that needs to focus more on the mitigation of the climate change? It's not the historic responsibility of our nations who are already in the front line of climate change impacts and who have not been developed. Large portion of the South Asian countries, people are still living under $1.25 a day on. Imagine those people, imagine the people from developed world who have been contributing 100%, 1000% times higher than the GHG emissions that we have been contributing to the global atmosphere. And again, we are debating ourselves that we need to focus more on mitigation and we need to challenge those developed world to focus more on mitigation and also not to be a recipient of the development fund that we are receiving. Development fund we are receiving through the ODA, that has been also through the convention, that has been agreed through a multilateral process. So if you do not agree on a multilateral process, and if you have to focus more on the mitigation aspect of the climate change addressing scenario, then it's no way that we are into the process. If we agree and respect the multilateral process and also the convention's decision, then we need to focus more on the articles of the conventions and also focus more on strategy. Let me say an example. Let me present you an example. When there is a situation that you need to protect yourself at the first, and then only you can think of other things. When you are in a situation, then you also think only about your life. When you are caught up with the flooding situation, then you only think of like what? When you are caught up in a flooding situation, then you only think of like how to escape that flooding situation. So first, we are also in the South Asian countries. We are in the front line of climate change. In fact, a series of climate extremism has been affecting us in that scenario. We also need to focus more on coping to the change that we are suffering from now. That is the adaptation strategy. And when you go to the long-term strategy, that is the adaptive capacity and the resilience capacity that we need to build upon it. But what we have been saying is like we are not only focusing more on adaptation here in our context. Given the example of INDCs and NDCs that we have submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention Secretariat, there has been clear mentioning about the mitigation effort that we can do through our own initiatives in the International Solar Alliance. Its secretariat is based in India. It has been led by the developing world. India was the leader in that alliance. We are also doing some from our side when it comes to mitigation effort. But when it comes to combat the impacts that we are facing at the front line, we have to deal with the adaptation issues at first. And for this, we need the financial, technological, and capacity building support from the developed countries for our own safety and to also avoid the catastrophic impacts that we have been facing.
So India is a rapidly developing country in the world, and what implications will the delegate of India face when their country is supporting deforestation, when their country is not supporting renewable energy in their own country? What force does the delegate of India has in the international community when they request the other countries to focus on it?
Well, when you go through the negotiation process and the negotiation within the convention system, India has been advocating for renewable energy support programs. India has been supporting the renewable energy support program. Having said that, India is facing trouble with the drought. That is the major challenge that India is facing. Even if you look at the India's NDC, there you can find the adaptation as a major component of their nationally determined contribution, which is particularly focused on mitigation aspect. But in South Asian regions context, if you go through the NDC nationally determined contributions, adaptation is the primary topic of that NDC, and then they focus more on adaptation rather than mitigation. But having said that, they also focus more on low carbon development strategies within their nations. They are focusing on that part. So our focus would be dealing with the first situations, that's the current situation, real situations, is that we need to deal with the climate change impacts in our daily life, and we need to do with that adaptation, proper adaptation measures in our own way, in our national circumstances, and then only we can look at the long-term future about mitigation aspects. Thank you very much.
The House thanks all the government speakers for their speeches and calls on the opposition whip as the last speaker of the debate.
Madam Chair, members of the House, very respected panel judges, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the Prime Minister for proposing this topic. It's a very timely topic. But unfortunately, I'm very disappointed point to see that there was no syntax, there was no definitions, there was no analysis. And as a matter of fact, there are fundamental contradictions on both sides of the government, which made it very difficult for us as those in opposition to understand what exactly is that debate really. So let's start off with what has been said, and in the course of my speech, I will be giving you two flashpoints and giving you a cost-benefit analysis as to see where this debate has gone in the course of the week and the course of these couple of minutes. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the motion today, and I would like to repeat, is that this House believes that adaptation should be the only response to addressing climate change in South Asian. Now, having said that, I find it very difficult to comprehend why both government opening and closing sites opponents spoke about mitigating effects and how we need to focus more on adaptation. Now, let me quote a couple of their statements and tell you whether we agree with them or not. Emissions are low. Yes, we agree. Survival is at stake. Survival people are at stake. Yes, we absolutely agree. There are 750 million people. They need to be looked after. Yes, we agree. People are vulnerable. Yes, we agree, ladies and gentlemen. The debate is not whether we disagree with adaptation. We agree with adaptation. But the question here is whether we are going to completely keep mitigation away and detach ourselves from this global consensus. And ladies and gentlemen, we disagree on it. We have no problem with prioritizing adaptation. Let's be clear. We have no problem with focusing on adaptation. Let's be question that. The question here is mitigation cannot be detached from. That has to be in the picture, ladies and gentlemen. And we have showed this in three arguments. We have showed it through a slippery slope. We have showed it in the concept of sustainable development. And we have also showed it to you how there is a global consensus around it. And this is an integrated problem and therefore it requires an integrated solution. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what are the two points in today's debate? The first clash point was about vulnerability and how there are so many lives at stake versus the whole progress which is going on right now. Now, the first thing we need to understand that the motion brought out in the House today is actually against the status quo because South Asian countries do have mitigated efforts. South Asian countries are working towards an integrated approach in combating climate change. They are not completely focusing on adaptation. Therefore, the motion itself is against the status quo. Now, having recognized that it is important to compare and analyze what sort of difference this proposal, this motion is going to bring about in the House today, under the first clash point, which is their whole explanation of people are vulnerable. Now, we need to understand that right now in today's context, we see countries from the developed side of the world giving funds, they're transiting funds to organizations, related to governments, etc. That's absolutely no problem at all. The problem is we see there is a massive lack in analysis to show us why this motion is actually going to better the impact we have today. Why is only focusing on adaptation is going to better the impact it has on vulnerable people today. And we have shown you that this motion, in fact, through these three arguments, are not only going to worsen the situation of individual people, but they are going to put countries, they are going to put entire regions in jeopardy in an international forum, ladies and gentlemen. Because we need to understand that it's a globalized world. No one lives alone. The entire concept of international relations is based on reciprocity, ladies and gentlemen. You are not going to be able to go to international forum like the United Nations, regardless of what the UN Convention framework is, and tell them we want you to mitigate when your own countries have given up mitigate efforts. That doesn't make sense at all. There is no principle in that, ladies and gentlemen. You are completely disacknowledging the fact that there is reciprocity in international relations. Next, ladies and gentlemen, let's go on to the second clash point, which was their argument about low emissions. Now they say that South Asian countries have low emissions, and based on that principle, there is no obligation, there is no responsibility, there is no duty for us to engage in mitigating efforts. So let us put this in this context. Several decades, several centuries ago, the developed countries were not developed. The reason that they are developed is because they went through an industrial boom. That was the whole industrial revolution. They went through all these phases and mechanisms. And despite only one half of the world going through this entire industrial boom, the world is in the state it is in today. It's so close from falling apart. We are reaching 3 Celsius degrees in terms of temperatures. Maldives will be no more, ladies and gentlemen. And it's ironic coming from a government that is representing Maldives. So the fact of the matter is, regardless of all of these statistics, the world cannot take another industrial boom from the east. Because if it is to take an industrial boom from the east, in the same way that it took it from the west, ladies and gentlemen, we won't have a world today. This is why you have all these this is why you have all these organizations working in progress, because we learn from the best practices. We learn from the lessons made, from the mistakes made and the lessons learned, ladies and gentlemen. and we implement those lessons learned in our country so that we don't have to go through the same, we don't have to contribute the same amount of damage that the West has contributed to the world. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in the course of this speech, what have I showed you? I have showed you that both the opening and the government side have been fundamentally from the word go, because they have supported litigation and they have supported adaptation, and we really see no basis on which we can argue against it, because they are essentially saying what we are saying, ladies and gentlemen. We all agree, and I honestly wish the whole world is in the same context as us, because that would make the whole world a much more better place. Then, ladies and gentlemen, we told you that we have brought up 3 arguments in the House, and we have based those 3 arguments and given you examples as to why those 3 arguments stand. And then fulfilling my responsibility as the opposition whip, I have brought you 2 fact points, and let me end this debate with a cost-benefit analysis. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a simple example. Let's assume that, for the sake of argument, we adapt this method. We go into a fully fledged process where we only focus on adaptation. Right? Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, all the South Asian countries are fully engaged in adaptation. We are completely detached from integration. What are the consequences? A, we are going to completely stop your funds that are coming in from the West based on adaptation. Because Western countries are going to be like, we cannot even focus on mitigation. What should we do funds for adaptation? We are going to completely cut those funds. You are going to lose your footing in international programs like the United Nations, like the United Nations Development Program, and any other regional entity that is there. And thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, you are putting your own country's status in jeopardy, because what you are essentially doing is you are not making your country's policies future-proof. There is no system of governance for making sure that there is stability in the future, because what you are doing is saying, give 50 years, give 70 years, when your country, and it is going to economic growth, comes there, you are going to be in the same state, and you are going to be responsible for the fate of this world. Thank you very much for listening.
The House thanks all 4 teams for this wonderful debate. Please cross the floor, shake hands, and wait outside. We're going to consider the decision and get back to you and call you back.
কোনো সমস্যা নেই, কোনো প্রথমবার আসছো এই লাইভ কি এখন চলে না? বন্ধ করে করতে গেলে
immediately.